So far, we talked more about the content. Maybe you could say the cognitive elements of the self-concept, right? Who am I? Do I perceive myself as intelligent or not intelligent? Do I perceive myself as a Coke or Pepsi lover? Do I perceive myself as a member of this group or that group? And so forth. But now we want to kind of shift that a little bit and look at the underlying affect, right? How do I feel about myself? Something we often describe with self-esteem. And what am I willing to do to keep up a high self-esteem, which we often refer to self-enhancement. Okay. So remember, this was like in the beginning I introduced you with this kind of very simplified self-concept with roles of myself, right? I'm a scientist, a husband, a father, a teacher, and so forth. So you can also now look at, if I evaluate all of these aspects, if I have to, if you would ask me, well, how do you think you feel about yourself as a teacher? Maybe sometimes I'm good or not, I don't know. Maybe as a father, I think I'm a good father, but I work too much and spend too much time with my children, then maybe I'm not such a great husband, and I'm kind of like mixed on a scientist because I spend too much time with my children and also too much time with my students. But overall, it seems like, let's make this maybe a plus minus two. Overall, it seems like I have a relatively positive self-view of myself. So if you kind of look at this together, if I would just be asked to kind of globally evaluate, what do you think of Andreas? How is your evaluation of yourself? Then I would come most likely up with a relatively positive score, I have to admit here, between the two of us. And this is often referred to as my self-esteem. So a global evaluation, an effective evaluation of yourself, the components of yourself, is looked as or called the self-esteem. Here you have Rosenberg's self-esteem scale, which has like 10 items. Here are 6 of them, and there are questions like, on the whole, I'm satisfied with myself. I feel I have a number of good qualities, and then you would kind of like, most people agree or strongly agree with these statements. So it seems like most of us have a kind of like a positive way of evaluating ourselves, and we are proud of who we are, or at least to some extent. You can now think about also like many different, just like smaller localized esteems. How do you think of yourself as a husband? How do you think about yourself as a father? How do you think about as a teacher, and so forth? And here you can measure these evaluations yourself. So here are some scales highlighted on the right side. There's a physical appearance self-esteem, there's academic self-esteem, social self-esteem, and so forth for professional self-esteem. So you can measure also localized evaluations of myself or different aspects of my self-concept. And sometimes more localized versions are much better predictor of behavior than more global ones. So for instance, your academic self-esteem might be more closely related to how you behave and act and feel when you're at university than your global self-esteem. So there's importance to localized self-esteem or evaluations of your self-concept. So now it kind of like one thing that is very surprising in some ways, and which was highlighted by Taylor and Brown in this kind of seminal article here, where it's like illusion and well-being, a social psychological perspective of mental health. And here they looked at the literature, and basically they looked at kind of like, okay, who has somewhat illusionary ideas about themselves? Is it those that we call mentally ill, or is it those that we do not call mentally ill? And here what they find in this large review of the literature is that actually people who are healthy, who are not depressed, who do not suffer from anxiety disorders, are those who kind of harbor some positive illusions. It looks like that you and I, people who do not have very strong mental health issues, seem to have a lot of positive illusions about themselves. They seem to think that they're mostly better than others. So for instance, as scientists, if you ask scientists, 94% of all scientists think that their research is in the top 5% of the field. It's absolutely impossible. And so we also think that good things will happen to us and not to others, which is often called the unrealistic optimism. And in general, we think of ourselves as good people. And it seems like that when we lose these illusions, when we kind of see ourselves a little bit better than we actually are, that this is when we slip into depression and anxiety. So on the contrast, right, we have these positive illusions here by Taylor and Brown, by Shelley Taylor, highlighted, which seem to be really important for our mental health. And then on the other side, there's something that used to be called, or still called, the depressive realism. Here's basically kind of looking at how accurate do people who are depressed and non-depressed judge the amount of control they have over their environment. And in this study here, in this seminal study again by Alloy and Apersim called Set Up Advisor, right, what they find is that basically the depressed people have a very accurate estimation of how much control they have over their life, how good they are in controlling their environment, while the non-depressed people, the people like you and me, have somewhat illusions of control. So there is this idea, there's this finding that is repeated over and over again in the literature, that people have somewhat biased beliefs about themselves, the control they have about their environment and their own future. So it seems like that we overall have a high self-esteem. We think of ourselves as good people, as moral people. But how can we keep this up? How is it that we can somehow maintain a view of ourselves that might not really be substantiated by reality? So this is kind of like one thing that goes back to a long tradition of research that kind of looks at what motivations do we have to fill our self-concepts with content. Why do we want to know who we are? So one by Yakov Trophy here on the left is self-assessment. So it's like, we just want to know who we are. We kind of basically jump into situations, we challenge ourselves, we do competition just to know, like, am I good at this or not? Am I intelligent or not? Am I a good person or not? So we want to basically assess ourselves, and we don't have any preconceptions. That is Yakov Tropy's view. And then there's self-verification theory here in the middle by Swan. And it's basically, Swan says, what we're trying to do is we have this idea of ourselves, wherever that came from, and now all we do is we try to self-verify that. And I think the extreme case, and we talk about this in a second, is that if I have a negative view of myself, then I'm also trying to justify my negative view. Most people have a positive view and they try to verify their positive view, but some who have low self-esteem will then try and self-verify this negative one. And here, there's on the right, there's good vibes only, right? There's self-enhancement. This is basically, I'm trying to do, I bias my information processing. I bias the way I pay attention to good vibes only, to only the good stuff, okay? So we have these three different contenders for how we fill our self-concept with knowledge. We will not talk so much about self-assessment because most social psychologists think that this only plays a minor role. But self-verification and self-enhancement had a big battle. Let's look at both of these arguments. So self-verification, I think, has some good evidence for it when it comes to interpersonal relationships. So Swan looked at a lot of low self-esteem people and how they behave in relationships. And what he can see and what I think I used to had a girlfriend who was very low in self-esteem. I thought she was a wonderful person, but somehow she never felt so. And what she tried to do in our relationship is basically to create a situation that would verify her negative self-view. So, for instance, she would always believe that my friends only like her because she is my girlfriend and not because of the person she is. So, whenever we would go to a party, she would basically kind of sulk in a corner and not enjoy herself. And then a friend of mine would come over and say, like, hey, it seems like you're not enjoying yourself. Maybe you want to go home. And she's like, you see, I told you, they don't like me. They only like me because they like you. And it often also would kind of be, she would kind of evoke or provoke certain negative reactions from herself and from others in order to verify her negative self-view. So there is some there's some evidence that, especially kind of intriguing evidence along low SES, people with not low SES, low self-esteem people, that they try to verify even their negative views. Okay, so self-verification has some evidence. However, I think the strongest evidence, the clearest winner for the strongest motivations we have in filling our self concept with information is self-enhancement. So let's think about this back again, about my kind of simplified view, or the view of my simplified self-concept, right? So let's assume that I have positive evaluations of all of these areas, a global positive evaluation of myself. So what happens if I'm threatened with negative feedback? How can I protect myself basically from any kind of negative feedback? So one strategy is called the ostrich effect. Okay, ostrich effect. One of these things, this bird that puts his head into the sand. And so here's like a seminal study by Loewenstein and colleagues, and they look at basically when do investors look at their account. And what they see is that we seek account information when we have the feeling that we will get good information on our investment account. So when the financial markets is up, then I'm willing to check my investment portfolio, because I think, oh, most likely it will be up. But if the market is down, maybe when I have more reasons to kind of act and sell something and try to save some money, I'm just not willing to confront my portfolio, because I feel like, okay, what I will get by looking at it will only be negative information. So it seems like, and to kind of generalize it, that we selectively deploy our attention. We only look at situations, or we seek situations that kind of confirm our positive self-view, that confirm a good state about our future and our amount of control we have in our lives, and we avoid negative. So this is one strategy, right, in which we seek situations that confirm our positive self-view and avoid situations that disconfirm it. I think I can always see that. I can often see that when I talk to students about the way they prepare for their exams, and often they avoid testing themselves. I tell them testing is the most important thing you can do for your preparation. But testing means also that you might realize that you do not know a thing about a certain area that you're supposed to be prepared for the exam. So people avoid testing because this tells them without any ambiguity whether they can do it or not. If they feel like, oh, there might be a chance that I don't know it, then I avoid it. So there's a selective attention deployment. There's also something like, okay, let's say I am forced to be in a situation that can give me some negative feedback or some good feedback. How do I handle this? One of the effects is called the mimic neglect effect by Sedekides and colleagues. So what they do in their studies is they present participants with a bogus personality test. So you fill out many questions about yourself. The answers are often very ambiguous, and you don't really know what to think about. And then they give their feedback. They give you some positive feedback, they give you some neutral feedback, and they give you some negative feedback. So you get kind of bogus or fake feedback on this personality assessment. You would help a person in need would be an example of something positive, and you would purposefully hurt somebody to benefit yourself would be an example of a negative feedback. So now I got this feedback, and now I do something else, and then at the end, 30 minutes later, sometimes a day later, sometimes several days later, I'm asked to recall. What do I remember from the feedback that I just got? And what they find here is basically to give you a first snapshot, and then we look a little bit closer at these numbers, is that people are really good at memorizing the positive or remembering the positive feedback and not the negative. So here you can see that they have always higher numbers for positive than for negative when recalling. I think this is important, that this is for the self. When this is done for like a bogus other person, when you have to remember feedback, for instance, for Chris and not for yourself. You can see that here, at least in this instance, the association flips. We remember the negative better than the positive. So you can see that for ourselves, we have a preference for positive over negative. And this is particular for central behaviors. We don't have so much a problem of conceding some negative things for peripheral behaviors, for things that do not really matter. So for instance, if you say to me that I'm not great at evaluating the quality of keyboards on a computer, I'm perfectly fine with that. I might even remember that. But if you tell me something that is central to myself, then I have trouble remembering it. Okay? So you can see here, this is just kind of like how do you call that? A replication of the same study that shows that for myself, I have a very good memory for the positive traits, not so much a very kind of meager recall of the negative ones. And I only see that for central aspects of myself and not for peripheral aspects of myself. So it seems like that the central, the core, the positive core is protected by this mechanism that lets me forget the bad things and remember the good things. So you can kind of test that further by showing that this is somehow related to a threat to the self. If you could come in and before you get positive feedback, I would inflate your ego. I would tell you what a wonderful person you are, how good you look and how charming you are. And then I would give you negative and positive feedback. Then your self doesn't feel so threatened anymore and you would take it. You would remember positive and negative feedback the same way. Okay, so even for central behaviors. So this shows that basically the strategy, this mimic neglect, the neglect of unwanted information is there to protect yourself from the threat. If your ego is boosted already, no negative feedback can threaten you and you're fine in remembering similarly well positive and negative. So you can also kind of look for that is especially important for high diagnostic behaviors. So let's say I give you feedback and the threat I give you is by telling you something really specific about you. So I said, like, in these situations, you tend to do this. So you can't really avoid it, right? So this is what's called high diagnostic behavior. So for instance, I might say on your test in this area, you did not perform very well. So this is something where it's like central high diagnostic. You can see this massive difference in how people remember positive versus negative. But if it's low diagnostic behavior, things you can easily explain away, okay, then we don't see this. And this again kind of underlines this idea that we have this mimic neglect, that we have in general these mechanisms in our memory and our attentions that protects us from things that threaten ourselves. Okay, so I have this animation. Here's like one final slide I want to show you. And this is something, a different study, same idea. So here is basically here kind of a study by Francesca Gino and colleagues, and they lured people into committing something immoral. Okay, and then they tested their feedback, their memory for the situation that was basically within the situation that took place, the immoral act. Okay, so we have a 30-minute delay when I'm asked to recall it, and a 4 days delay. So here you can see the nature of it's moral or neutral, and here they did something bad. And you can see that 30 minutes later, they have a very similar recall of the situation for the moral negative one, and for the nature of the act, the neutral one. But now you can see this massive drop after 4 days. Now people barely remember anything when they committed something immoral, but they have a pretty good or still somewhat accurate memory of when they did something bad that was somewhat neutral. And why I'm telling you this is because, and we will come back later to it at the very end of our course in social psychology is that one aspect that the South is especially obsessed with, that we're keen to keep, is that we are good people. And so what we do is sometimes we need to kind of act a little bit self-interested. We need to once in a while lie a little bit, or take a little something from our workplace, or commit certain minor slides, some certain minor immoral acts. And yet we still need to believe that we are good people. And how do we do that? We just forget that we did something bad, and thereby we can remain positive about ourselves and have still a positive self-esteem.